Switzerland didn't get rich by accident, and it's not what you think. Most people believe Switzerland is wealthy because of banks, chocolate, and watches. That's the tourist version. The real answer is a system so quiet, most countries don't even know it exists. And once you see it, you'll understand why Switzerland doesn't just compete with other rich nations. It operates on a completely different level. But wait, before we begin, please subscribe to ensure that you never miss out on any of my essential stuff. Comment, "I subscribe" below, and I will personally welcome you to our community. With that said, let's get started. Here's what they don't tell you. Switzerland isn't a country. Not in the way you think. It's a federation of 26 states, called cantons, and each one runs like its own country. They set their own tax rates. They control their own budgets. They decide their own laws. This isn't just administrative. It's strategic, because when cantons compete with each other, something happens that most governments try to avoid. They have to stay efficient. Let me show you what that looks like. In the canton of Zug, corporate tax rates sit around 12%. Just 2 hours away in Bern, it's closer to 22%. So what do companies do? They move, not to another country, just to another canton. And here's the part that changes everything. The people vote on it. Every major decision, tax changes, infrastructure projects, even public spending, goes to a public referendum. Not every few years. Constantly. Switzerland holds more referendums in a single year than most countries hold in a decade. You know what that does? It kills waste. Politicians can't hide behind bureaucracy. They can't promise programs they won't fund, because the people who pay for it get to say no. But most people miss the deeper game being played here. See, when tourists visit Switzerland, they see expensive watches in Zurich shop windows. They see private banks with no names on the door. They see chocolate shops that charge $30 for a box. And they think, this place is rich because of luxury. Wrong. Switzerland is rich because it built a system that makes luxury possible. And that system starts in places most visitors never see. Let me take you to one. There's a small town in central Switzerland called Appenzell. Population, 5,600. You won't find it in any travel guide. There are no five-star hotels. No international headquarters. But every year, on the last Sunday in April, something happens that reveals how Switzerland actually works. The entire town gathers in the town square. Not for a festival, for a vote. It's called Landsgemeinde, an open-air parliament. Every citizen stands in the square, raises their hand, and votes directly on laws. No representatives. No hidden votes. Just people and policy. This still happens. In 2024, now ask yourself, when was the last time you stood in a room with your government and voted on the budget face-to-face? That's the difference. Switzerland didn't centralize power and hope it would trickle down. They kept it local, kept it visible, kept it uncomfortable. And that discomfort is the key. Because here's what most wealthy countries do. They create distance between decisions and consequences. A politician in the capital raises taxes. Someone 300 miles away pays for it. By the time people realize what happened, the politician is gone. Switzerland removes that distance. When a mayor in a Swiss town proposes a new road, the people who live on that street vote on whether to fund it. If it's a bad idea, it dies immediately. If it's necessary, it gets built. No committees, no consultants, no 18-month feasibility studies. Just accountability. But here's where it gets more interesting. This system creates something most countries can't reproduce, economic competition inside the country. Let me show you how that plays out. The canton of Zug, the one with 12% corporate tax, didn't start wealthy. In the 1940s, it was farmland. Quiet, poor, forgotten. Then in 1947, they made a decision. They slashed corporate taxes and invited businesses to move in. And they came. First a few, then hundreds. Now Zug hosts over 30,000 companies, including global giants like Glencore, Siemens, and Procter & Gamble. Population of Zug today, 130,000. That's one company for every 4 people. But here's the part nobody talks about. The other cantons didn't complain. They adapted. Geneva went after international organizations. Zurich doubled down on finance. Ticino targeted Italian-speaking businesses. Basel became the global hub for pharmaceuticals. Each canton found its edge. And because they couldn't rely on the federal government to protect them, they had to stay competitive. You know what that created? A country where inefficiency dies fast. Now let's compare that to what happens almost everywhere else. In most countries, if one region starts falling behind, the federal government steps in. They send subsidies. They create programs. They try to equalize outcomes. Sounds fair, right? But here's the hidden cost. It removes the pressure to improve. If a region knows it'll get bailed out, why would it cut taxes? Why would it streamline regulations? Why would it compete? Switzerland doesn't do that. If a canton makes bad decisions, it suffers. And the people who live there feel it immediately. That's brutal, but works. Because the moment people feel the consequences of bad governance, they vote it out. Let me give you a specific example of how far this goes. In 2013, the Canton of Geneva proposed raising the minimum wage to $25 per hour, one of the highest in the world. It went to a public vote. The people of Geneva rejected it, not because they didn't want higher wages, but because they understood the trade-off. Higher minimum wage meant businesses would leave. Jobs would disappear. The tax base would shrink. So they voted no. Now, imagine that happening in most democratic countries. A minimum wage increase gets blocked, not by politicians or corporations, but by the workers themselves. That's what happens when people control policy directly. They can't blame someone else for the consequences. But here's the uncomfortable truth. This system only works if people are educated enough to make complex decisions. And Switzerland knows that. So they built an education system designed to create informed voters, not compliant workers. Let me show you how different that looks. In Switzerland, kids start voting in school referendums at age 12. Not pretend votes. Real decisions about school budgets, events, policies. By the time they're 18, they've already voted in dozens of referendums. They know how to read a policy proposal. They know how to calculate cost versus benefit. Most countries teach kids to pass tests. Switzerland teaches them to govern. And that changes everything. Because when your population understands economics, you can't lie to them about debt. When they understand tax policy, you can't hide spending and bureaucracy. When they understand trade-offs, you can't promise everything to everyone. Swiss politicians operate in a system where the voters are smarter than they are. And that's by design. But here's where the system gets even more ruthless. Switzerland doesn't just decentralize politically. They decentralize economically. Which brings me to something most people don't know. Switzerland has almost no natural resources. No oil, no gas, no coal, landlocked, mountainous, tiny. So how did they become one of the wealthiest countries per capita on Earth? They turned limitations into leverage. Let me explain. Because Switzerland has no resources, they couldn't rely on extraction. They had to rely on transformation. Take something cheap, make it valuable, sell it for more. That's why they dominate in precision industries. Watches, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, machinery. A Swiss-made watch doesn't just tell time. It's a financial instrument. A $20,000 Rolex holds value better than most stocks. Swiss pharmaceuticals don't just treat illness. Roche and Novartis produce some of the most profitable drugs on the planet. But here's the key. None of this happens by accident. Switzerland doesn't subsidize failing industries. They don't protect companies that can't compete. If you can't add value, you don't survive. And the result? Swiss companies are forced to be world-class or disappear. Let me show you what that looks like in practice. There's a company in Switzerland called Stadler Rail. They build trains, but not normal trains. They build trains so advanced that cities across Europe, the US, and Asia buy them despite Switzerland having almost no domestic rail manufacturing market. Why? Because Swiss precision engineering became the standard. And that didn't happen because the government gave them money. It happened because the system demanded excellence. Now here's the question that makes people uncomfortable. What happens to the people who can't keep up? Because if Switzerland only rewards productivity, what happens to people who struggle? This is where the system reveals its coldest edge. Switzerland has social safety nets, unemployment benefits, disability support, healthcare coverage. But, and this is critical, they're not designed to be comfortable. If you're unemployed in Switzerland, you get benefits for up to 2 years. Sounds generous. But here's the catch. You have to prove you're actively looking for work. Every week, you have to attend job counseling. You have to apply to positions. You have to report your efforts. And if you don't, benefits get cut. Fast. The message is clear. We'll help you get back on your feet, but we won't let you stay down. Compare that to systems where unemployment benefits last indefinitely, where proving you're looking for work is optional, where the incentive to return to productivity disappears. Switzerland builds pressure into the system, intentionally. And yes, that's harsh, but it's also why their unemployment rate hovers around 2%, even during global recessions. Now let's talk about something most people think they understand, but actually don't: Swiss banking. Everyone knows Switzerland is famous for banks, secret accounts, hidden wealth, financial privacy. But here's what they miss. Swiss banking dominance isn't about secrecy anymore. That era is mostly over. The U.S. forced Switzerland to share account information in 2009. Automatic information exchange started in 2017. So why do the ultra-wealthy still use Swiss banks? Because Switzerland offers something more valuable than secrecy: stability. Let me put this in perspective. Switzerland hasn't been in a war since 1815. Over 200 years of uninterrupted peace. No invasions. No regime changes. No revolutions. That means if you put money in a Swiss bank in 1900, it's still there. The government didn't seize it. Inflation didn't destroy it. War didn't erase it. Name another country that can say that. You can't. And that stability isn't luck. It's policy. Switzerland stays neutral in every conflict. They don't join military alliances. They don't pick sides. They don't invade anyone. And they make it nearly impossible for anyone to invade them. How? Every Swiss man serves in the military. And when they finish, they take their rifle home. There are more guns per capita in Switzerland than almost any country on earth. But here's the part that breaks people's brains. They have almost no gun violence. Why? Because guns aren't tied to identity. They're tied to responsibility. Every Swiss citizen knows that if the country gets invaded, they're the defense, not the army. That shared responsibility creates a kind of social trust most countries can't replicate. And that trust is what makes the entire system work. But here's the part that'll challenge everything you think about wealth. Switzerland isn't just rich because of smart policy. It's rich because they're willing to make decisions other countries won't. Let me give you the most controversial example. In 2014, Switzerland voted on immigration quotas. The referendum passed. Switzerland implemented caps on how many people could move there from the EU. The EU was furious. They threatened trade consequences. They called it xenophobic. Switzerland didn't back down. Why? Because the people voted. And in Switzerland, the people's vote isn't a suggestion, it's law. Now here's the uncomfortable question. Was that racist? Or was it economic self-preservation? Because here's the thing. Switzerland has high wages, strong worker protections, expensive housing. If unlimited low-wage workers flood in, what happens? Wages drop. Housing prices spike. Social systems strain. The Swiss voters saw that trade-off and voted to protect what they built. You can disagree with that decision, but you can't say it wasn't democratic. And that's the paradox of Switzerland. It's one of the most democratic countries on earth. And sometimes democracy produces results that make people uncomfortable. Now let me show you how deep this system actually goes. Because Switzerland doesn't just let people vote on laws. They let people vote on money. In 2016, Swiss voters were asked, should we give every citizen a universal basic income of $2,500 per month? No work required. Just money. For everyone. Sounds like a progressive dream, right? The Swiss voted it down. Hard. 77% said no. Why? Because they understood something most UBI advocates ignore. Someone has to pay for it. And in Switzerland, the people who pay for government programs are the ones voting on them. So they did the math. They realized it didn't work. That's the power of direct democracy. It forces people to confront trade-offs instead of just demanding benefits. But here's what that creates: a population that thinks like investors, not consumers. And that mindset shift changes everything. Let me show you what I mean. In most countries, people see the government as a service provider. You pay taxes, the government gives you stuff. Roads, schools, healthcare. In Switzerland, people see the government as an investment. You pay taxes, and you expect a return. If the return isn't there, you vote the program out. That's why Switzerland has one of the lowest government debt-to-GDP ratios in the developed world, around 40%. Compare that to the US at 120%, Japan at 260%, Greece at 180%. Switzerland doesn't spend money it doesn't have, because the voters won't let them. But here's where it gets even sharper. Switzerland also has a constitutional debt break. If the government runs a deficit, they're required by law to make up for it in the next economic cycle. No exceptions. No excuses. Imagine if your government worked that way. Imagine if politicians couldn't promise programs they couldn't fund. That's Switzerland. And it's why their currency, the Swiss franc, is one of the most stable on earth. But here's the cost nobody talks about. This system makes Switzerland expensive. Painfully expensive. A coffee in Zurich costs $8. A meal at a mid-range restaurant runs $40 per person. Rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Geneva averages $2,500 a month. If you're not earning a Swiss salary, Switzerland will bleed you dry. And that's intentional, because high costs filter out people who can't contribute. If you can't afford to live there, you leave. If you can, you stay. It's economic Darwinism, and Switzerland doesn't apologize for it. Now here's the question that ties everything together. Could this system work anywhere else? And the answer is probably not, because Switzerland has something most countries don't and can't create. It has a population of 9 million people, small enough that referendums actually work, large enough to have economic power. It has 4 national languages, which means Swiss citizens are used to navigating difference without conflict. It has a culture of personal responsibility that goes back centuries. You can't just copy Swiss policy and expect it to work in a country of 300 million people with no shared civic tradition. But here's what you can learn. Decentralization works. Local accountability works. Forcing governments to compete works. And most importantly, when people have real power, they make better decisions than experts think they will. Switzerland proved that. They took a landlocked country with no resources, no coastline, no empire, and turned it into one of the wealthiest places on earth. Not through colonization, not through oil, not through luck, through a system that makes inefficiency impossible. But here's the final uncomfortable truth. This system only works because Switzerland is willing to accept inequality. Zug is richer than Jura. Zurich is richer than Appenzell. And Switzerland doesn't try to fix that. They believe competition creates progress, even when it's uneven. So here's the real question. Would you trade equality for efficiency? Would you accept a system where your vote actually mattered, but so did everyone else's, including the people who disagree with you? Because that's the system nobody talks about. And it's the reason Switzerland is richer than almost every country on earth.